I want to welcome up Daniel Griggs, the CEO of CMD Security, to the stage, and he's going to talk about balancing security and compliance.
Thank you. Let me get situated here. So the mic's working. That's great. Hi, everybody. My name, as he said, Daniel Griggs, founder and CEO. I'm on the Mac admin Slack at Dan Command CMD, and also Dan at CMD Sec. Love to talk about security, so if ever you have any questions or just want to chat about stuff, absolutely hit me up. So today, excuse me, who I am, that's more important than what we're talking about today, according to me. So I worked previously at NIST, the Department of Defense, and the Pentagon. I helped write the iOS and macOS security standards. If you're hip to those things, for those communities, it's the STIG. Otherwise, most people have zero idea what that means. That's why I omitted it in the slide. I had the very good fortune to start CMD Security with my very best friend, Eric Metzger. If everybody can just indulge me just one quick second. Oops, I'm sorry. Just say hi, Eric. So we get on the recording on 3. 1, 2, 3. Hi, Eric. Awesome. He's going to love that. Thank you so much. So what we do is we just provide managed IT and security services in the DC area. Typically, it's for high-profile, high-risk individuals and larger enterprise companies. And so today, what I want to talk about is, in short, kind of why. You know, security seems important. Everybody is concerned about security, but why? We'll dig into some basics of the security standards. We'll go into where to expand on some of the security standards, kind of, well, okay, so I met these 30 things that the CIS said I should do. What else should I do? And there's some very concrete steps we can all take. How to leverage some of the built-in Apple tools to, again, expand on those standards, and then kind of tie everything together with Jamf Pro. So why does this matter? Because I hear this so much of, no one knows about my company. Well, the cold virus doesn't know about you either, but you still somehow get the flu every winter. You feel sick, you get stomach aches. It doesn't know about you either. You're just collateral damage. There's automated attacks that happen. The target might be one of your clients. It could not even be you, so you work for Target, or you work for a Walmart, or those kind of places. Excuse me. And even more and more companies are just requiring this basic, I'd even call it IT hygiene, in order to do work with them. So if you need to do work with us, you have to be compliant to, just to pick one, CIS. That's the Center for Internet Security, for those who are not familiar. There were a few talks about it from Jamf folks. This JNUC, if you missed it, I highly suggest you check it out online once they post them all up. So why does this matter? I'm still not convinced. Try again, Griggs. I don't believe you. There's also regulatory requirements. So the government might be saying you have to do it. There's also customer lawsuits where if something happens and you didn't do this, they can come back and say, you didn't do your due diligence, you weren't doing your job, I'm going to sue you super hard. And if nothing else, if none of those other things apply to you, they're just kind of a good idea for everybody to do. They're just general best practices in 99.9% of cases. And we'll get into some of the corner cases as we talk through this, but in general, they're very good documents, most of them. All right, fine. I believe you. So what about, what is a security standard? Effectively, what it is just a big list of changes and checks that you have to do to a computer to kind of meet what you should be doing as IT people for security. Things like HIPAA are kind of more vague, which means it's more process-oriented. What do we do if bad things happen? And the more technical ones are more like CIS, where what do I do specifically to a Mac to make it secure? To use the health analogy is in order not to get the flu, wash your hands, eat well, and work out twice a week. But that doesn't apply to everybody, but in general, it's a good idea. What do you mean by less technical, though? Is, again, what to do if bad things happen. It's more process-based. A computer gets hacked, who do we talk to, what happens, and when? And the technical guides are how do we prevent those bad things from happening in the first place. And I use Bad is kind of a vague term on purpose because that's dependent on your enterprise. I mean, bad could be somebody running a sudo command if it's a hospital with nurses who shouldn't be running sudo commands. But if it's a whole shop of developers, running a sudo command is just normal operation. So the bad is very dynamic and dependent on who you are and what you're doing as a company. So some of these computer standards that I've been talking about, just to kind of spell some of them out. CIS, Center for Internet Security. The STIG that I mentioned is more for the Department of Defense focus. PCI if you have any kind of credit card information. HIPAA for healthcare information. And Sarbanes-Oxley if you have to do financial information. Excuse me, I almost tripped up on that one. It's not great for my credibility. I am terrified of public speaking, so this is a bit of a step for me. So we'll get through it. In general, some of the more technical ones, basically we're trying to stop automated attacks. You can argue that any of these do any three of these, but in general, kind of waving our hands a little bit, it stops automated attacks. So these script kiddies that are always running scripts against the internet, there's kind of drive-by attacks that don't really care about you specifically. They're just hoping to catch somebody like you in a dragnet. The end-user training, kind of the phishing emails or the social engineering or the spear phishing if somebody cares about you specifically. And the continuous monitoring and response, that's more for the advanced attackers and the targeted threats. So I care about you specifically. I want you specifically to have a bad day. The only way you can really protect against that is if you're really watching. And that goes beyond antivirus. That goes beyond a lot of the typical tools that we use. But we can use the Casper suite, Jamf, to really manage that and control it and be able to detect all of that. And I'll get into that a little bit later as we go along. So as I said, some of the JNUC talks from this year, I believe you missed the boat on all of them. I think there's a compliance panel tomorrow morning that you should all go to. If you are in this talk, you should go to that one. There's also a couple of GitHub repos from Jamf Pro services that are great. They have some scripts to help you meet their CIS specific, but a lot of the security standards are a lot of the same things and a lot of the same controls. So CIS will get you most of the way towards most of the other security documents. So in general, I mean, I hope I'm getting this through to you of just, we believe Griggs now. Standards seem like a good idea. They seem pretty well thought out. But what do we use them for? So you've talked about the general ones, and you've talked about the specific ones. How do we think about this? And it's a little bit specific in language, but it's security of the environment. So like a team effort. So between all of the IT teams, between all the IT people, how do we make sure that our environment doesn't threaten any computers that come into it? An example of this would be like the hotel Wi-Fi. How do we make sure that the hotel Wi-Fi doesn't get compromised and attack any Mac that connects to it? It's basically providing a secure platform to do work. And the opposite of that, security in the environment, to use that hotel Wi-Fi example, to make sure that you on the hotel Wi-Fi don't attack other people on the hotel Wi-Fi. Basically protect data and content. Why I think security standards are great? Honestly, it's just an actionable to-do list for most environments. They've been battle-tested over years, and it's literally teams of experts telling you the best way to do things. I mean, it's some of the best advice, and it's the cheapest advice you'll probably ever get, because you just have to download it. I don't know of any that are paid downloads. A lot of them are, there's none that I know of that are free, paid downloads. All of them are free. You might have to sign up for an account for one of them, but they're all free. But it's not without their flaws, because they do sometimes fall short because they are so generic. They're not written with you in mind. They have to be attainable by most people, because if they're too hard, people won't try. They'll fall out of usage and fall out of relevance. And they don't write the configs for you in most cases. That's why Jamf Pro Services has all those scripts available on GitHub. And a lot of them are focused on set and forget. which, as users of the Casper suite, we do not set and forget. We continually manage our machines. And I said Casper suite again. My apologies to the Jamf folks. And a lot of times they're based on the previous standard. So last year's version, the 10.12 one is based on 10.11. The 10.11 one was based on 10.10, so on and so forth. So you get a lot of legacy controls that are still in there, just because nobody in the collection of minds of all the experts could make a valid case for dropping it. The other bad news is you don't get to decide if you did it right or if you were successful. You have to have somebody else come in and audit all of your operations if you're really trying to become compliant. So you can't be the judge and the jury. You have to rely on outside sources, even if within your same company, just somebody else to come through and talk through all your choices and make sure that you did the right thing. And if we all just take a moment and just close our eyes and think about how bad an audit would be of our current environment, is about that bad. Because basically, if you were super prepared and you closed your eyes and you thought, it's not that bad, it won't be. But if you're sitting here worried, like, well, am I sure I turned off all the file sharing? Am I sure I turned on all the firewalls? Am I sure File Vault's on? It's not going to go well for you. And actually, it's counterintuitive. You actually want an auditor that's super good at their job, who's super technical, because then they know the why, and you can talk through decisions rather than just making, well, you are supposed to turn off the IR blaster and you didn't, so you fail the audit. Nobody has IR blaster turned off because the new machines don't have IR blasters. It's like, why would I turn it off if I don't have it? So what we do is we learn our new favorite word, pedantic. And what does pedantic mean? It means of or like a pedant. But actually it means excessively concerned with minor details or rules. So in the example of the IR blaster, basically what I have done and continue to do, don't tell anybody else, is just write a plist. The plist that they're looking for to disable IR blaster, or the IR receiver, excuse me, on the computer. So if ever there was an IR receiver ever plugged into the computer, it wouldn't work. But that is such an unlikely scenario, and it doesn't have one built in, but now we passed the test. So a lot of things are great for the environment, they're great for the security of the environment, they're great for your computer health, but sometimes there's like one or two that are just kind of, excuse me, but dumb. And that's what you end up having to do is these kind of trade-offs of like, okay, I will write the plist that disables the IR receiver even though it's not going to do anything. But now I pass your check. Thank you. We no longer believe Griggs. Standards seem bad. Lots of work for me, lots of auditing, lots of legacy controls. And it's all a trade-off, is my point to all this. There's no perfect security. It's always a compromise. There's always some kind of bargain you have to make for the sake of usability. Because if we wanted perfect security, we'd lock them up in a safe and never use them again. And that's easy. It's done. But what we need to think about is, as far as users, so in this case, they is users or groups of users. I should have typed this out better in the slide. But based on your company specifically, how do these groups of users work? What do they work on? Like, is the information classified? Is the information just shouldn't be released? Or is it personal health information? What's their job role? Where do they work? Do they work in a Starbucks, or do they work in a super secret skiff where you have to badge in 3 times before you can even get there? All those considerations go into how lenient you can be on this next slide, which is, I would rather you do a bad thing than a worse thing. So a lot of people get hung up on file sharing. A lot of people get hung up on AirDrop. A lot of people get hung up on Slack. But the reality is, if you turn off on the left-hand side file sharing, AirDrop, or Slack, people will find a different way to do whatever it was that thing did. So they're going to use thumb drives and drop them in the parking lot. They'll use an unofficial Dropbox, or they will just text message people. iMessage is better, but for this analogy, we're going to ignore that, and we're going to say they're going to use text messages because that's bad, and it's unencrypted. So this has all kind of been theory, and it's really kind of, you've got to think about as you go through these documents, what were they trying to solve? Not so much explicitly, I have to turn off file sharing as the perennial example, but they want to turn off file sharing, but it's not always turning off more features. What were they worried about? What was the background to this thought process? And the STIG and the CIS, when you download the Excel version of it, they will actually provide the reasoning in one of the right-hand cells of we are disabling this because of this vulnerability, or we are concerned about this scenario happening. And that helps you with the previous slides of determining, do I really need to do this based on what my users do, where they do it, and why they do it, with what kind of information. I think you're going to begrudgingly start to believe me again. They seem reasonably well thought out. And then the other common question I get is, where do we fit in the hierarchy of folks as far as security research? So us as admins, where do we fit? In general, so there's the theory side, where it's the cryptographers, the scientists, the other super smart folks. They're deciding, should we use AES 256, or is that not okay anymore? Should we go to 512, and what are the trade-offs, and those kind of things. It's protocols in math. For the most recent, the crack Wi-Fi attack, most people, can we just get a nod real quick to make sure people are, yeah, okay. They would have been the ones who discovered the vulnerability, those kind of researchers. The second tier, I don't want to say down, because they're all relatively equal, but the second group of folks are Apple security researchers, so people who are actually writing code. So basically, they would patch the apps OS, or really apps or OS, to work with the decisions that the theory folks have decided. In this crack Wi-Fi scenario, they would be the ones patching the operating system. And then what we would be doing is actually applying those patches to the operating system. We're more the implementation phase of this whole thing. To follow through with the crack Wi-Fi attack is basically, once it's been decided what to do, we actually do it with Jamf. We push it out and we make sure everybody has it of whatever OS version ends up being that patches it, because there's been some dispute about when and how it's been patched. But once it's been decided, we make sure it happens. So most of our thought process shouldn't be around in these guides where it might say, the CIS guy says you have to use this crypto algorithm with this kind of protocol with this. We shouldn't be worried about trying to nitpick those things. It's more the implementation thing of, based on my use case, I hate to pick on file sharing, but file sharing, is that okay? And that's not as a company, that's per group of users. For VIPs, is that okay? For the tech team, is that okay? And you just kind of walk through and make your own notes in that same Excel document as you go forward. And it sounds like I'm about to sell you something, but I promise you, I'm not going to sell you anything, because it's all for the low, low price of free, and it's all something we all can do ourselves, because all you have to do is live off the land from what Apple already gave us. You basically add functions to the Apple systems that are already there, and using Jamf Pro to make sure that those systems stay in place and stay running. So kind of in general, what you want to do with any of these solutions is you want to stay out of the kernel space if at all possible. Because that way, we're going to be adding apps and scripts and everything, and if ever there's a problem with one of our apps or scripts or anything else we add, we want that to be as low impact as possible. So if somebody exploits something we did, they get rights as the user that it runs as, not as the kernel, which is just full compromise and everybody's having a bad day. So basically, we used Apple processes that are already in the kernel to talk to things that we write and then does management actions. It's kind of the general flow. And as we go through all these, this is all stuff that I have in production. I'm just going through some of my tips and tricks and tools that I use and I think could be useful for other people. So basically what we want to do with some of these tools, first and foremost, we want to persist on the box. Like our management tools persist on the box. We want to make sure you can never uninstall Jamf. We want to make sure you can never uninstall the antivirus if we use one. and make sure I can always talk to the machine no matter where it is, so I can do what needs to be done no matter where it is. We need to monitor as much as possible, and by that I mean like system logs, and also the BSM audit logs, which I'll get to. And I want to be able to, if something happens, I want to be able to disable a Mac if something bad happens. And I want to be able to make and verify changes at any time. So I've heard, as I'm walking around the conference, of the weekly recon. That's a dirty word and a dirty phrase to me. I mean, you can do hourly maybe recon, that's okay. It's not ideal. But as often as you can recon and get as much information of the JSS so your extension attributes are as up to date as possible is really, really, really good. So basically, building resilience into the system is the top one. Not every enhancement is more restrictions, some of it's more hooks. Make sure everything always works. Make sure your monitoring always works. And that's mostly to do with Jamf. Some of that is to do with what Apple gave us, the packet firewall. The packet filter firewall, I think there's 2 Fs, but there's only one in the abbreviation. It gets weird, especially when you're under the spotlights. But some of the example actions we can do is block known bad IPs. This link up here that I wish I had made bigger font actually has a document, and like it runs you through exactly how to make these types of rules. If I have a list that I subscribe to that has all these known malicious IP addresses, no computer of mine should ever talk to these, so I will just automatically block those. Block all internet on a compromised machine, which I'll talk about here. So basically what I do is I have a launch daemon running on the machines that is looking for a plist. When I detect a problem, I use the Apple push service to push down a setting to that plist. The plist previously doesn't exist. Once my launch daemon sees that plist change, it reloads the firewall with the restrictive settings. And what those restrictive settings do is it blocks all traffic by default, so this kind of flows from top to bottom. So the first matching rule, besides there's exceptions. So by default, block everything except for you can go outbound to my Jamf server on the second line. You can go outbound to my VPN server on the third line. And on the fourth line, you can go outbound to anything Apple. So basically what that lets me do is I have blocked the machine effectively from any malicious activity, but I can still remotely talk to it with Jamf. I can still remotely talk to it with APNS, and it can still VPN into the corporate network if I decide that I need to SSH into that machine or do something else more substantial. And basically what it is the launch daemon watches for that PF lock. I just named it arbitrarily. It doesn't have to be called PF-lock. It's just what I chose. And then it runs PF control reload the firewall with this other PF-lock config. By default, the PF firewall is already running on all Macs, and it loads a etc pf.conf file. So I just renamed it something slightly different. And you may ask yourself, this is a lot of work when I can just MDM lock the computer just through Jamf, just push the little lock thing. Well, what my version does is you can remotely enable the machine again. So if I do an APNS push of, remove that setting from the plist, now the PF firewall reverts back to what it used to be. I can retain the Jamf connection, whereas if I push the MDM lock, it's just dead. You got to walk it physically to somebody to fix it. And all that leads into a better user experience. Plus, if things really go bad and you try to push this and it doesn't work, you can still just do the MDM lock. It's still a fallback. It's still available to you because nothing we did in this, can I go backwards? Previous step would stop the MDM lock from happening. And I'm big on user experience, and I pride myself on the fact that none of my managed clients have figured out that they're managed and figured out that I have such hardcore security on their machines. They just kind of don't realize it. And that's because of things that I do like this, where I am suspicious of something that happened. I push this, I call them up and talk them through and say what changed recently, and I decide that everything's okay now. I push it back, and then they keep on going. I never have to physically be in person. No tech person has to physically touch the machine. Whereas an MDM push, you would. Somebody would have to tell you a code or something like that. And another good way, I didn't touch on this at the top, I glanced over my notes. One of the good ways is to kind of ask yourself questions like this. So if a virus ran on my computer, would I know about it? If somebody made a configuration change on one of my computers, would I know about it? Just plain English, talk through some scenarios. And the easiest way to do if a virus ran on one of my computers is BSM auditing. By default, it does not audit these things. By default, it just audits login events and authentication events. But what it is actually authoritative, whereas the unified logging, like the normal syslog that we all know and will, quote, love, if it happened, it's there. Whereas the unified log, it's still kind of an optional right. Most people do, but it's still optional. And I will caution with this, lots and lots of testing, because it's very easy to brick machines by creating too many logs. If you turn on everything that BSM can do, it will fill up your hard drive very quickly. So just something to be aware of and test for before you push this to any kind of production. So how you do that is all the configuration files for BSM auditing are in this etc security folder. The one we want to change is audit control, which, as the name might suggest, controls auditing. And these flags are kind of categories of events we want to know about. EX is executable, PC is process creation. And we just add that to both the flags, which is, I know what user ran this, and the NA flags, which is non-attributable, I can't talk today, whatever. The flags that they can't attribute to a user, meaning that would be the root user or somebody who is doing some extra fancy exploit stuff. That is how you can also tune down some of the logs if you are getting too many, is to take out some of the root events. But not too many, because they end up being some of the more important ones. So when you add that, the important thing to do is when you're making these slides, is not add too much text. And then you do this. So this is actually just one event for me running sudo. And what we can do is we can walk through some of this. So let me back up one before I jump into that. So how I looked at this, there's a command called PR audit that shows you the plain text of these otherwise binary log files. The -S is for short version, which makes things plain English and generally the nicer version of labeling things. I highly suggest you use the -S, especially when you are learning. So because I'm unoriginal and couldn't think of a better example, what I ran was actually sudo PR audit -S var audit current. So what we're looking at is the log of me looking at the logs. So it's a little bit cross-eyed, a little bit recursive. But so this is the command that ran, and then we jump ahead, and this is the executable path. So this is where it searched for that PR audit command, which can be very helpful if somebody has a lot of homebrew stuff or has a lot of gem or NPM stuff are generally problems as far as executable paths. So if you have somebody who put a copy of bash in somewhere else and moved that above bin, that could cause some issues, lots of issues actually now that I think about it. And here we actually get a little record of the print working directory, so where I was when I ran PR audit -S. All this is very useful, and it spells where I used to be, the old print working directory right next to it. And then we also get down here, which is, this gets a little bit technical, and this is like a college class all in itself. But basically what this means, the first DAN is the audit ID, so who was logged into the system. The second one is who I was running as. The third one, the root. Or excuse me, the root was who I was running as, so I sudoed, so I was root. Wheel is obviously the group that I was running as. And then effective UID, which is hard to get into in such a short time, but for argument's sake, it's who I was pretending to be and who the system thought I was when I ran this command. Even though I was actually Dan, the system knew me as root. So all this combined, you can start, and these are going by at hundreds a minute. And you can get a very good picture of what's running on the machine, from where, why, and how And once you start creating some patterns, you can really do some really interesting security features. And especially if you get into something like Splunk, you can start doing some really cool analysis on all of this. Following on that, so not just what they ran, so what if they made that configuration change? Would I know about it? And the short answer is just extension attributes. Start checking plist files and start reading from the default command to read the as the system knows it to be configurations. In essence, the kind of the theme of all of this talk is check things multiple ways and do things multiple ways. And if you could think of kind of a quirky way to do it that some attacker wouldn't know to think of, go for it. As long as it is stable is my only caution with that. But if you can think of some quirky way to do things, that actually is better because it's less likely to be covered by somebody who's trying to cover their tracks. Also, verifying changes to the machines kind of builds off the configuration changes. So if I need to, I'm sorry to keep picking on file sharing, but if I need to make sure that nobody in my organization has file sharing turned on, we just found out about the new malware that is spreading that way. We need to be double sure that nobody has it on. How do I know that? And it's the classic example of extension attributes. What I will add is don't do the run once policies. Key it off of a smart group that is keyed off of those extension attributes. So I have an extension attribute that replies, yes, no, Dan has file sharing on. I key off a policy that runs on anybody who has that does have file sharing on to continually fix it. Rather than the run once, look at it, run again on people, a manual process, make it automated is the one thing I will add to the typical wisdom that everybody goes out. Lastly, I want to talk about persistence on all of these things. So remember all those really hard to uninstall applications, some of the, I don't want to name names. Actually, I'm going to back away from that. I'm not going to name any names. But all of the really hard to uninstall applications, steal ideas from them. So we had a launch daemon itself. Oop, I lost my mic. Yeah, there we go. So we have a launch daemon that fixes itself and an app that tries to uninstall some things into some tricky ways. It makes like a triangle of this app trying to keep itself alive and installed. The one name I will name, because they're not great, is MacKeeper. Does some of these shenanigans where there's some keep alive logic. And in general, you do kind of want to mimic that kind of triangle of the three things keep each other alive. So you can smack two of the gophers, but the third one will fix the other two before you can smack the third gopher kind of thing. So basically, if we're doing this in the Jamf context, Jamf already gives us one of those threes, and that's the typical Jamf launch daemon. That will, if you quit the Jamf process, it will launch it again, and away you go. So what if we did a old school Linux cron job that made sure that Jamf launch daemon was there? What if we went even older school and went to some RC scripts and made sure that every time the system boots up, Jamf is installed properly? What if we did some other just regular user startup items to make sure that Jamf is there and running properly? Because once we get the Jamf launch daemon there, we can have Jamf policies that run and fix everything else. We just need that initial run of everything. And that's kind of the persistence I'm talking about, where it's resistant to meddling in all ways except for sudo Jamf remove framework. But even then, you can use any one of these to have a reinstall script. I believe Rich Troughton has one, Casper check, I believe is what it's called. There's also a couple others from Jamf and Jamf IT, which I believe is still Jamf, but I'm not sure if that's an unofficial one. I'm not sure. But with that, that's kind of me up on my soapbox. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. And if anybody has any questions after here and was afraid to stand up for some reason, I'm also Dan CMD on the Mac Admin Slack, and that's also my email. But thank you. Everybody heading out, or is there questions? We'll give it last. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What is your favorite antivirus program?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
What do you recommend for antivirus?
The question was, what do I recommend for antivirus? And right now I use Malwarebytes, but they all don't do as much as they should. and the ones who do as much as they should significantly impact system performance. So there's no good choices, and what I chose was Malwarebytes.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
I work in higher ed, and I'm trying to convince leadership that we're not just break fix in IT, we are risk managers for them. And security is on them as well. What do you think the best route is for enacting standards in organizations? Is it develop policy and then put them in place, or put them in place and then develop policy?
You want to have policy in place first, because there will always be friction, and you want to have a clear set of steps, and rules is too strong of a word, but clear steps to take once somebody has an issue with what you've done. I can't see the other mic. Are there people lined up over there? No? Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you.